It's crazy to think that wars were fought over fruit, but it's true. The Banana Wars is a nickname given to a series of U.S. military interventions in Latin America during the early 1900s. But before we dive into this topic, it is important to understand the historical context behind it. Our story starts during the Gilded Age, a time of extreme industrialization and condensing of wealth in the hands of the elites. Many industries, such as steel, were dominated by one company that owned all means of production and transportation. These companies were able to use their power to lobby for laws that benefited their monopolies. Big companies having lots of influence in the government became a common trend in the early 1900s and during the Banana Wars. Around the same time, the U.S. found itself gaining a lot of resource-rich land from the Spanish-American War. The first companies to tap into the vast resources of Imperial America were fruit companies. So while pineapples and sugar were grown in Hawaii, Latin American countries like Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Honduras became the center for banana production, specifically by the United Fruit Company, now known as Chiquita. Just like the big steel and oil companies of the Gilded Age, fruit companies began to have an increasing influence in the government, especially with foreign policy, because of their deep involvement in foreign countries like Latin America. But to what extent did U.S. corporate interests in Latin America, such as the United Fruit Company, influence American foreign policy from 1898 and beyond? Well, while the United States interventionist foreign policy in Latin America during the Banana Wars was outwardly framed as protective and stabilizing relief for Latin American countries, the Banana Wars and the following foreign policy was heavily influenced by the economic attachment of the fruit industry to Latin America. Setting up a blueprint for future foreign policy meant to restrict nationalist or communist agendas and to maintain U.S. economic control in its sphere of influence. First, we should start with outward public messages by the U.S. government explaining their reasoning for interventions in Latin America. A great example of this is the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which explains that if any country in Latin America proves to be continuously unstable and defaulting on debt, then that country requires some intervention by a civilized country. According to the Monroe Doctrine, Latin America is placed out of European influence, which means the U.S. might be forced, in some cases, to intervene as the only civilized country suitable in the area, giving the U.S. a role of an international police power. Augusto Sandino, a Nicaraguan revolutionary, gives us the perspective of a Latin American in his proclamation to abolish the Monroe Doctrine. In his proclamation, he calls his fellow Latin Americans to fight against Yankee imperialism and explains how the Monroe Doctrine is used to hide the real intentions of making money and reigning over Latin American politics. He calls for an army to use all means necessary to rid Latin America of Wall Street bankers. We can see how the U.S. uses its public messaging like the Roosevelt Corollary to frame its interventions in Latin America as charitable, but its foreign policy is influenced heavily by other factors like money and the fruit industry. It's not surprising that the fruit industry impacted the foreign policy of the U.S. in Latin America just because of the sheer involvement American fruit companies had in Latin America. This is the reason why many Latin American countries were nicknamed banana republics. To demonstrate this involvement, here is a United Fruit Company advertisement which pictures the company's Great White Fleet. This 50-vessel fleet was originally used as refrigerated shipping for bananas before they expanded it to a luxury cruise line. The fact that a fruit company has expanded to tourism just shows the domination that they hold over Latin American countries as a source of profit. And the sheer size of this great white fleet describes how much control companies like United Fruit had over banana production. John Cabot, the Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, explains his meeting with the Guatemalan ambassador. This Guatemalan ambassador describes the United Fruit Company's monopoly on Guatemalan bananas, even describing it as a stranglehold on ports and railroads. He even goes on to blame stress tensions between Guatemala and America on this monopoly that United Fruit holds. The sheer involvement that fruit companies like United Fruit had in Latin American countries made them economically dependent on the banana industry, which causes instability and consequently U.S. intervention in those countries. Moving on, all of this intervention in Latin America in the early 1900s created a blueprint for the U.S. to restrict nationalist or communist agendas and continue making money in foreign countries. John Leddy's memorandum, as the officer controlling Latin American affairs, lists when American interests are being threatened in Guatemala. These interests include the Guatemalan government attempting to nationalize United Fruit's holdings and other companies like International Railroads of Central America and the Electric Light and Power Company. This reflects other events later in the 20th century, like Iran attempting to nationalize oil, and helps America set up their response for that crisis. One of President Taft's annual messages to Congress proves how economically motivated U.S. intervention in Latin America was. He describes Latin America as a great natural wealth, and specifically describes a situation in Nicaragua where a revolution against an American-backed government led to threats to American property. He set up a framework for future interventionist policies by sending 2,000 troops to maintain order and maintain an American business-friendly government. In the end of this speech, he justifies this intervention in the eyes of the public, where he explains how U.S. bankers would offer loans to help Nicaragua back on its feet. All of this is very identical to the American-backed reinstating of the Shah in Iran after threats of nationalizing oil there. We can see that this practice of intervention started in Latin America with the Banana Wars. While the Banana Wars can be an undertaught subject in many history classes, it provides a perfect example of the development of United States interventionist foreign policy as a tool used by the government to maintain their economic influence in other countries, while marketing it as charitable relief. Foreign policy during the time of the Banana Wars is very important as it impacted much of American history after it, even if it is lesser known than Cold War foreign policy.